Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining in on our panel on changing trends in fraud. My name is Ashish Jain, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at Arcos Labs. We are a fraud and abuse prevention platform where I get to work with a variety of companies across gaming, e-commerce, banking, fintech, and many others. I'm very excited to welcome two of the leading industry experts and practitioners in the fraud space to this panel, and I'm looking forward to having a great discussion. So let's start with some introductions. Gauri, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ashish, for having us here. My name is Gauri Gopalakrishnan. I lead collections, recoveries, and enterprise fraud for Mission Lane. Mission Lane is a fintech focused on providing fair and clear credit and financial services for the underbanked customers in the US. I've been with Mission Lane for about a year, prior to which I spent close to 20 years with Capital One doing various roles within the credit card business. Great to be here.
Glad to have you here, Gauri. Raphael.
Sure. Thanks Ashish and Gauri for the presence and for being here with us. Hope that we can provide some insightful thoughts today. I work for ClearSale. ClearSale is a fraud prevention company focused on online retailers and online merchants in general. I've been with the company for 13 years. So pretty much my whole career spent looking at card not present fraud, identity theft. My own background is in data science. So I came from the operations side, and nowadays what I do is I oversee the ClearSale operations in several countries where we work. We have been analyzing transactions to more than 170 countries. So that's been a challenging journey when it comes to fraud worldwide.
Nice to have you here, Raphael. So I'm going to start with an easy one. I'm sure it's in the top of minds for both of you. The last 18 months has been kind of strange. Like the pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation. We see a lot more product and services moving to the online model. And as you expect with that, we see an increased amount of online fraud and abuse. I'm curious to kind of hear from you, like what are some of the lessons that you learned during COVID? How did you pivot? And how does that kind of change or impact your strategy going forward? So maybe Gauri, we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think, speaking primarily from the point of view of a credit card issuer, because that's one of our largest businesses, I'll start with first a non-fraud impact that COVID has had. Largely given all the stimulus and the government support, we saw a softening of demand for credit. And given the customer segments that we focus in, which is really the underbanked, that's actually not a bad thing at all. It really helped folks rationalize their household balance sheets and so on and so forth. So it was great for people at large, for US consumers at large. However, there's a gift that keeps giving, which is that because there's so much transfer of funds and some fairly large amounts from government entities to folks, there's obviously a lot of scams or a lot of schemes to steal that money. Now, we weren't directly impacted because we don't do loans and banking services, but my guess is that there were a lot of identities stolen to monetize that, and those stolen identities now have made their way into more credit businesses. And for example, one of the things that we saw earlier in this year was some pretty sustained attacks of bad identities trying to get cards. And while we were able to fend them away, deeper research, investigative research suggested it's probably folks who stole identities, or rather very likely stole identities as a part of unemployment fraud because of COVID. And what I found fascinating, to answer your question directly, is that's circling through the system. So yes, they stole those to steal money from the government, done what they needed to. Now they're using the same identities to harass other folks like us issuers.
Interesting. And by the way, I just see that Rich has joined in. Hey, Rich, maybe we can do a quick introduction for you. We just got started without you. And then we've been discussing that how has COVID been impacting the business of yours and your customers, and how does that kind of impact your strategy going forward? So maybe we can answer both of them at the same time.
Sure, great. Apologies for my technical challenges, but I would say first, my name is Rich Stuppy, Chief Customer Experience Officer with Count and Equifax Company. Great to see all the folks on the panel again. As far as COVID, one of the big ways that they have, it has challenged many of our customers is it became less about fraud and more about survival. And we were seeing a ton of super creative, super much brute force reimagining of the last mile, whether it was buy online, pick up in store, curbside, ship from store, do whatever you needed to do to fast forward those digital innovations that you've been talking about for years. And holy smokes, now's the time to do it. We saw that in a big way. Tons of people learned lessons that a pure play e-commerce retailer learned over the course of decades. They learned those in days. And frankly, it was painful for some of them. And fraud was one of those lessons. So the big thing to me was re-engineer the last mile for survival's sake, get to the customers however you can get to them, and digital was the way to do it.
It's interesting. It's almost like this become a forcing function, like, that you have to learn, otherwise you will be obsolete. And Rafael, you get to work with a lot of merchants too. I'm sure you have some stories to share.
For sure. And I guess Rich hit the nail on the head when he mentioned the digital transformation almost to be forced by, retailers that had the digital channel as just a small part of what they were doing. At some point, they were 100% what they were doing in terms of sales. And that drove a lot of discussions internally at the merchants, but also between merchants and their partners, right? The importance of the partners and suppliers and vendors related to the digital channels increased a lot. As much as the volume of sales increased on the digital channel. So my main takeaway here, almost as a consequence of what Rich said, is the how important was during these last 18 years to deal with the scale, right? So at some point you had increases year over year above 300%. And you had to deal with that, whatever that means in terms of whether or not you have manual review, whether or not you have, your rules-based system or your machine learning system adapted to the new scenario. So this new volume, the new volume that was driven by this digital transformation, I think that was the number one challenge. And along with that comes where this volume comes from. It comes from usually first-time buyers. And then the behavior of the first-time buyers is what probably challenged us the most, in my point of view, because how can you differentiate, how can you tell apart a first-time buyer, let's say somebody who has never done an online purchase and acts a little weirdly as far as behaving, versus a fraudster that might, the patterns might be too similar. So that was the most interesting thing in my point of view.
That's actually interesting. I'm going to tee off on that. Like the signals that you get from a first-time buyer and the signal that you get from a fraudster, because you don't have history. The buyer, the first time using a device, fraudsters, they randomize many of the device and IP fingerprinting are the same, and then you have to find the right balance in between the right security and the right experience. You want to deter the fraudster, but you don't want to annoy the buyer, especially if it is the first time buyer. So how do you kind of balance it, and what are some of the learnings that you strike that you provide the most optimal, the appropriate amount of friction to the first time buyer? So maybe Rafael, you can kick it off.
Sure. Yeah, I guess the first thing to keep in mind, in my point of view, is understanding that as much as we like as fraud specialists, the innovation, the new technologies, we gotta always think about the other side of the screen, right? So you will have an user, and especially if it's gonna be a first-time user, customer experience will matter a lot whenever they're choosing their merchant or how they're going to buy something. So we have to take care, because it's tricky. As much as we want to innovate and add new layers of protections, if these new layers of protection include somehow additional layers of friction to the customers, that's definitely something that you should, think twice before apply, right? So yes, we love the biometrics and the biometry and taking a picture and stuff of that nature. We usually in the fraud space may want to use as much as we can of those new, new features. But the reality is that if those new features add frictions, then you're perhaps sending away some of the consumers, especially the first-time buyers. So my number one takeaway here is understanding that fraud prevention is not only about reducing fraud, but also about keeping your eyes on the conversion. And by conversion, I don't mean only the declines that you make after the transaction is placed, but also the people that eventually abandon the cart or abandon the buying process because of the additional layers of interaction you added, either additional checkout pages or additional fields in the form. Any of those additional layers have to be thought twice when it comes to customer experience, so that you can not only reduce fraud but also keep your conversion rates as high as possible.
Yeah, I think it's like a combination of the active challenges, whether it is biometric or other means of authentication, and the passive challenges. And you need to combine them both to create the most optimal experience. Gauri, have you implemented something like that in your organization?
Yeah, I mean, look, nothing specific as such in that, there's no one thing that we've done to optimize the experience. Obviously, conversion is a big deal for us. And when I talk about conversion, that could be a login attempt, or it could be a new account going through to booking. We try to minimize friction as much as we can, knowing that in the fight for fraud, there's always this trade-off between, the false positives. You'll always get it wrong. And our hope is and always has been to minimize the false positives as much. In the last year or so, some of the advances that we've made on the fraud side clearly have led to better detection. But as we take our growing portfolio and learn from it, we made some significant moves in reducing some of the friction and false positives. Really, not by anything special. Of course, we keep adding in, taking away tools as per need. It's really just having more data and more experience with really understanding what our customers do with us, and that's helped us a lot to, continuously to retrain our models and our scores and algorithms to try to figure out how do we keep balancing or continue this balancing act of fraud prevention and friction.
Gotcha. And Rich, what do you see in your customer base around this balance of security and experience?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we see, and there's a fraud component to it, but it's really the idea that everybody, including fraud partners, are talking about customer experience. And then what does that mean? That means taking what used to be the heart of the merchant business processes and customer journeys, and the very purpose for this conference, which is the mobile payments conference, right? The very heart of that was the payment. And now, because they've redesigned their customer journeys, they've got what I would characterize as many, many, many different paths to a payment. And some of those paths equate to loyalty, which is talking about lifetime customer value. And some of them are talking about disputes and returns, or merely contacting a customer with the right offer at the right time in the journey. And that's different than assessing payment fraud. What you're really doing is putting the appropriate amount of sensors and inspection and controls in each step of that journey, because some of them are going to be high data, some of them are going to be low data. You have to do it invisibly, it has to be very accurate, and it has to cover the entire journey, both pre-purchase and post-purchase. Most people are not really considering their entire customer journey and therefore entire customer experience. They're starting at the middle and working out slowly. A lot of bad stuff can happen at the frayed ends of that journey.
Yeah, I think you brought up an interesting point that I think, and that look, the customer comes in, shows up at your website and creates an account and log in and browse it through the site and do a checkout. Or if you're banking, then do the business, then you have to be able to have checkpoints and not just, initially. So you have continuous risk-based challenges and authentication throughout, which that also triggers is that in the past 5 years, the amount of tech stack and the data that we have available to us has changed significantly. Like the underlying tech has changed. And we get to talk to a lot of company where the investment in ML and AI to be able to detect the fraud, which humans cannot do. And Gauri, you alluded to that a little bit earlier. I'm curious to see that how much ML and AI have been playing a role in terms of detecting fraud in this modern tech stack world. And Gauri, since you brought it up that you have been working on it, I'm curious to see your feedback, and then we can go around the room.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share. Look, ML and AI get used, misused, whatever, appropriately or not. The way I look at it, you need ways, models, algorithms, whatever ways to detect, changing trends and changing patterns. And like I mentioned earlier, as an example, where as the more data we got, the more data we were able to train on our models, the better decisions we could make, which in this particular case led to an improvement in our false positive rates, along with detection. And that's a constant battle. I mean, look, you can do that multiple ways. You can have, in my ideal dream state is having a model that changes itself over time. I'm sure those exist. I think more practical versions are of being able to harness what a machine can do is just continuously monitoring and updating your thresholds, updating refactoring your model every 6 months or so on and so forth, or rebuilding it, and maybe every year to just make sure you keep capturing the latest insights. And what we also keep doing is run a bunch of tests at all times to make sure we keep getting orthogonal reads to really capture places where our models have blind spots, or where where we deliberately make suboptimal decisions for the sake of learning. The idea is you keep training the model on places it's never been, and that's how we really get to a place of either getting better detection or minimizing the false positive impacts.
And Raphael, as a data scientist by profession, what is your take on how effective ML and AI have been in your customer base?
Well, I guess the fraud prevention industry was built over systems that were basically rules-based wrongly, right? So that is the past and the history of our industry and our set of landscape of vendors. I guess the rules are still necessary. I guess, in my point of view, it's going to be always a hybrid. And at some point, the machine learning algorithms, the AI, started to play an important role. In my point of view, nowadays, it's not more a question of whether or not you will use machine learning. It's basically everybody's using some sort of it. But different from other technological features like two-factor authentication or elements that in tech, machine learning is not a matter of using or not using. It's how you use it and how effective are the algorithms you build. Because I mean, if I could build an algorithm that could be considered AI with 3 rules that add 3 points or minus 4 points. That's gonna be an algorithm, but the effectiveness will be questionable, right? So I guess what the modern days have brought to us is one, more unstructured data. So things that we weren't able to collect or we weren't able to work with in terms of creating the variables of our algorithms, and also the amount of data, right? So the volume of data that years ago you could never work, and nowadays the infrastructure and the new algorithms and the new techniques allow you to manipulate a huge amount of data. So I guess the question mark here nowadays is not, again, whether or not you're using machine learning, AI algorithms, and so on, but how you use it and how effective it is. And I guess it gives us the scalability so that you can work with multiple stores if you are multiple brands, if you are a merchant, or multiple merchants if you are a vendor like us. And then you got to be wise in connecting and using the combination of, the rules that still play a role, but also your algorithms, whether or not they are adapted to each customer or to each case, as Gauri says, because you need to have some sort of routine in terms of adapting and updating it, because it's not like a static issue. Instead, I guess it's fair to say that you got to keep it updating as much as you can.
Fair enough. And to add to that, Rich, you are a data company in many ways. Mm-hmm. What's your, I guess, impression and learning of the adaptation of ML and AI in your customer base?
We find it certainly helpful. And in the fraud space, we're big believers in both supervised machine learning that is based on historical events and historical outcomes, and unsupervised, which is really real-time understanding of linkages, clusters, anomalies, etc. But the thing that a lot of people don't talk about is and it's related to the customer experience, the customer journey, and the effectiveness that Rafael explained, is there's a tremendous investment that needs to be made in creating a real-time pipeline that is always available and has the necessary data to make decisions upon. That's, except for some of the very largest players in the space, most people have no business trying to invest in making that work. Now, the other question is, do you have the data necessary to make those decisions? And what we believe strongly is data transparency. We help and believe in solving the fraud problem for folks, but also making the data on which we solve those problems available, which that enables people to use that data for less than for high value use cases that aren't necessarily real time. So take some data, take it offline, figure out who your best customers are, take some data, take it offline, figure out why the hell people are buying pink socks. Figure that stuff out, because one of the byproducts of fraud control is a massive amount of both digital data and real life data, physical data. If you get access to that, you can generate a ton of value. And that I think the generation of value based on the data is what everybody's talking about, but I don't see it happening in a lot of situations.
Yeah, so I think you touched upon it a little bit, and based on my experience of working with many customers, and even at eBay where I was running INT and risk fraud teams, the two biggest challenges I've seen is, one of them is the data pipeline availability. Like sometimes we underestimate the amount of effort, especially in big legacy companies. What does it take to make all the data available so that you can apply the right amount of feature extraction? The second thing I think people miss out is whether or not you invest into monitoring the tools to measure the efficacy of your ML models. To your point, everybody does it and it becomes one of the 30 inputs into your rules engine. But I feel like sometimes people put the models, but if you ask them, did you end up incrementing or incrementally improve your fraud by 2% versus 5%, it is harder to come to a concrete answer. And that eventually leads into, should we continue investing or not? So on a related topic, the ML and AI, it's not available just to you guys and the risk practitioners. It's also available to all the fraudsters. So I'm sure they have upped their tech stack. And one of the questions sometimes we ask is like, what drives innovation from a fraudster standpoint? Like at Arcos, for instance, we have this underlying principle. We call it like the bankrupting the business of fraud. And our belief is that you want to make it economically not viable for a fraudster to attack your business, and then they will go somewhere else. And hence, we want to force them to use premium IP, so it's more expensive. We want them to use actual devices instead of emulators so that it is harder to scale. We want to have them spend more time in solving our challenges so that their ROI and profits are a little bit less. From what you have seen, what do you think is what drives kind of fraudsters investment in this? Is it street cred? Is it politics? Is it money? What have you seen so far? So Rafael, maybe we start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I guess your answer has the seed for, or your question has the seed for the answer, where you guys, and I agree with the approach that you described, where you guys feel and treat them as a company, right? So looking for profit. So my point of view is that what drives them is the money they get out of it. And the reasons why I believe it is, one, when we look at the products or segments that are more, they're attacked the most, they will be the ones with where it's easier to resell. So you're going to talk about, small electronics and then apparel and stuff like that. And even if you get into gift cards and stuff that are basically directly the money itself, then it's going to be even more risky, right? The second piece of evidence that I would like to share is when it comes to for instance, the process that the US is going through or was going through and other regions went through in the past of the EMV. So when you put a chip and pin into the physical transactions on POS transaction, and makes it harder for fraudsters to use it, what happens in 9 out of 10 cases in the country's histories is the fraudsters moving towards the online transactions. And what that tells us is that our job is not necessarily to stop them from doing it, but but actually sending them somewhere else, because there are many political, historical, economic, and social reasons why somebody becomes a fraudster, and it's not our job necessarily to make it stop, but actually to send them somewhere else.
Just
so
make
my
it more
point,
expensive, yeah.
Exactly, make it more expensive, in other words. So one thing that I like to share with the merchants or people who are talking about fraud prevention for the first time is that you may think about this youngster making a transaction with somebody's credit card in their house, but actually that's not what we actually face. What you usually face is very organized criminals with, as you said, Anish, like a tech stack, ability to create bots, etc., and there's a black market of information and data very active in the deep web. So that's the picture we should have in our minds when it comes to the fraudsters.
Rich, what have you seen?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've seen that I think is going to change the face of fraud for many, many years to come, if not forever, is the idea that the COVID relief protocols that were put in place, both in the US, UK, and really across the globe, they were put into place with great haste. We had very little controls over and very little fraud protection over the way you could extract money from them. And as a result, tens of billions of dollars have moved from COVID relief into the hands of organized fraudsters. In the US alone, over $100 million of COVID relief fraud was committed by incarcerated prisoners in only the state of California. So what are they doing with that money? Well, as Rafael said, they're a business and they're investing in their tech stack. So they're buying better data, they're buying better automation. They're probably throwing a hell of a party too, don't get me wrong. I mean, when the money's easy, the money's easy. But what people don't understand is how that has changed the face of fraud, and the arms race has really accelerated. And then the one last other checkbox is, I would say, for the folks listening that are part of the Western societies, there is a fair amount of anti-Western sentiment out there, and it brings a smile to people's face when they're causing Western governments, companies, power companies pain. And I don't think we should forget that. They're still taking the money, but they're enjoying it extra.
Yeah, I think to the point that there's a very organized crime. And one thing I think that we don't do a better job of in the industry, trying to share our best practices and building on standards with each other, so that, I think sometimes I feel like the fraudsters are a little bit more collaborative with each other in terms of the economy that they have created. compared to how we collaborate with each other. Like an example I keep bringing up is that every fraud company that I talk to have some kind of a device fingerprinting, and we still have not yet agreed upon a standard schema that we can all collect from the device and then share with each other for insights. And hence, if there are ways that I feel like we can collaborate a little bit better than what we have done in the past. So one question which came up, I'm gonna in the chat was that and Gauri, I'm gonna ask that to you. The buy now, pay later usage has been growing substantially in the US. And what level of fraud are you seeing with this kind of an offering? And even though the credit has been one way or the other been there for a long time, but we see a lot more investment in the buy now, pay later. Do you have any insights or thoughts of how this is having a new kind of fraud?
I do, yeah, multiple thoughts. My initial reaction is it's another way for folks to finance, and therefore it's is no different as stealing a credit card and defrauding what we see there, right? And so one answer is no, it's not the same. The other is that there may be something specifics about BNPL which I may not have thought through, but a fraudster thought through and figured out loopholes in those. And those largely come down to the companies offering those BNPL solutions, how they integrated into the websites of the merchants that provide them or at point of sale. I think those might end up becoming the weak spots, right? And so I think those might be the new or the incremental vectors to incremental to the fact that this is a fundamentally lending product, and every lending product will get attacked, will by default and might have some level of fraud. And the bigger it is, the more lucrative it might be for fraudsters because more people are going there.
Yeah, and by the way, one specific example, one of our other customers shared, which is kind of related, that they saw this fraud, this one fraudster who created a synthetic identity, and they kept it for like 10 years. And then they kept applying to buy a Porsche, a car. And then what they did is they eventually got financed. They bought the car, and the same day they sent the car overseas. And then, so after a month, when the payment is done, the car is already gone. There's nothing you can do. It's synthetic identity. You can't track back. So just this whole buy now and pay later, I feel like put even more risk into this whole kind of credit system that we have, especially in this country. So I know we only have 2 minutes left. Any last 30 seconds, a message that you would like to give to the audience? Rich, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think BNPL is hotter than hot right now. Yes, it is attracting fraud because it is relatively easy to monetize that handoff. But another bigger problem is we're seeing merchants really not know when to employ BNPL because it is more expensive than a traditional payment of pretty much any other sort. And they feel pinched in a big way to offer it to everybody. And the folks that are working on figuring out what's the right time to offer it for fraud and ability to pay reasons and profitability reasons are onto something.
Thanks, Rich. Raphael, 30 seconds for a closing comment.
Sure. I guess my comment goes back to one of the answers you asked me about, the false positive. My point of view is that the fraud game is a numbers game, and the numbers is going to be always a combination of what you spend with fraud, but also what we spend with not selling to the people you wanted to sell. So that is the one thing that I would like you guys to keep in mind.
Sounds great. Gauri.
I'll go back to the points we discussed about the fraud stack and or rather stack the fraudsters are being able to create and with the new technology, so on and so forth. I will add that in addition to having access or probably even being on the cutting edge of machine learning and AI, they also do this in a completely unregulated way. All of us as organizations have rules to follow, have adverse action notices to provide. They don't, and you can argue that their rate of innovation ought to be much higher, which just makes it our job, I won't say harder, but I'd say challenging. And that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, no, challenging and interesting. And I know we're about time. So I want to thank you all, the panelists, for an engaging discussion. I'm sure this is a topic close to your heart and we can keep going for hours. I want to thank the attendees for listening in and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you all. Great to see you all
Thank you
again.
all. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.